Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third in our series of the Performance Puzzle webinars. This session today is about the nature of ethics in business and the importance of ethical business behaviour, and in particular, the role that HR might play in encouraging this. I'm Gary Cookson, I'm your host for today, and I'm going to take you through for the next 20-25 minutes talking about some of the ethical issues that present themselves in an HR context. So if you've not come across the Performance Puzzle webinars before, this is the third in a series of 12. They're all being recorded. They're all on slightly different topics to give you a feel for the kinds of things that MOL Learn do and provide in a professional qualification, to give you an idea of what it might be like to learn with us. And if you've not come across MOL Learn before, then here is some information about MOL Learn. We're part of the LTE group, so if you want to learn more about us, you've got information there on our website. There's lots of case studies and learner testimonials and so on. If you've not come across me before, then often easier for me to describe my life in pictures rather than words, but I've got 20 years working in senior HR director roles across a range of different sectors: central and local government, further education, social housing. I'm a qualified personal trainer. I've got a young and growing family, and I do a lot of keynote speaking and writing, and I deliver some of MOL Learn's CIPD qualifications and CMI qualifications on an associate basis, so may bump into some of you at some point there. So let's have a look what we're going to be doing today. Well, as I said before, my aim is to cover about 20-25 minutes worth of content with you today. You'll be able to use the chat panel to interact with both me and anybody else in the webinar today. So you can use the chat panel. You can also use the Twitter hashtag of Performance Puzzle if you want to tweet anything that's going on today. And I'll have time for questions both as we go through and then again at the end. So I mentioned before, we're doing 12 of these webinars, and you can see here what's happening in each one of those. So we've done the work-life balance and health and well-being one, and today we're looking at ethical leadership. Recordings of previous ones have been made available, so if you need to get access to those, then I'm sure you're able to do that, and hopefully you signed up for the remaining ones. So let's get going. My objectives for today then are threefold. I want to have a look at what ethics actually is within an organization and understand its impact on employee engagement and performance, and then finally to identify how we are doing some of the different things and what we need to do to make things work ethically in a business. So that's what we're going to do. So first question then, this isn't a poll, I have got some polls coming up in a second, but just a question for you to mull over. Is there a rising need for ethical behaviour in businesses? And give me your thoughts in the chat panel if you're able to, or tweet out your thoughts if you're not. But I think what we find in business nowadays is too many managers robotically following rules rather than making decisions with their hearts and their minds. And this is backed up by a lot of research done by the CMI and Moral DNA. I'm going to share some stats from that a bit later on today, and we'll be able to share the link to this research a bit later on too. And what this shows is that modern workplace cultures are often dominated by rules, bureaucracy, and targets, and that causes managers to leave the principles at home and switch off their sense of care for others. So what I'd be interested in you telling me is examples of businesses or organizations that you're familiar with who've had an issue around ethical behavior. Can you cite any particular businesses that you're aware of, you might have seen in the media in the last few months or years, that have struggled with ethical behavior? I think there's quite a few, and what I'm hoping is that you're well aware of some of the bigger ethical scandals in recent times. So in case they're not mentioned, I'm thinking of organisations like the BBC, who've had issues themselves. Sports Direct have had issues on an ethical basis and what they pay their staff and how they treat their staff. Primark have got issues around modern slavery and some of their supply chain. You've got Mid Staffordshire NHS Trust and issues around lots of patient care and safeguarding stuff, and the News of the World with phone tapping and phone hacking and so on. So there's lots of examples of unethical behavior around in business. And where's this all headed? Because it doesn't seem like a day goes past without another example of a business behaving poorly. And ethical behavior if you look at the Business Dictionary online, is defined as acting in ways consistent with what society and individuals typically think are good values. But it's not defined any more detailed than that. So ethical behavior, when it's done in line with society values, individual values, tends to be good for business and involves demonstrating respect for key moral principles like honesty, fairness, equality, dignity, diversity, and so on. So if you get these things right, it should lend itself to better performance in a business. But here's a dilemma for you. So I'm going to share a poll in a second, and here's the question for the poll. So if we could share the poll on screen, this will allow you to answer this. This is about turning a blind eye to things. So which one of these, or as many of these as apply, would you turn a blind eye to? So hopefully we'll get a poll up for you to respond to in a second. And if you're not able to respond to the poll, then feel free to put your responses in the chat panel or to tweet out your responses. But things like stealing stationery, we've all seen it happen, but have we turned a blind eye to it? Somebody does it once, takes a pen home, does it bother you? But if they do it every day for a year, would that bother you? It's theft at one level. So how does it stack up with your own sense of ethics? And then what about banter? Well, banter is often explained away as just banter in workplaces, but is clearly unacceptable. So how do we deal with banter? Do we turn a blind eye to it if it happens just once? And what if it happens again and again? So the word repeatedly appears here, and I'm told that the polls are not available, so please use the chat panel to give us your views on this one. But would you turn a blind eye to any of these, or would you turn a blind eye to none of them? So I'm interested in your views on what you'd turn a blind eye to, because I think we'll have a range of answers here, a range of views, and this is an interesting discussion starter in any team meeting. What do you think about people stealing stationery from the workplace? What do you think about banter? Does the word repeatedly change your view of the ethical behavior and the act itself? So it'd be very interesting to see your views. So get them coming through in the chat panel if you're able to, please, or using a question, and just give us your views. It's interesting, people will have a range of different responses to this. So let's move on. I mentioned before the Chartered Management Institute and the Moral DNA have done some research on ethical behaviour. So let's have a look at some of the stats that come through this. And there's a lot of good information comes in this, and you'll see it start to appear on screen now. So what this research is telling us, and I'll share the link to this after the session, is that strong management ethics and organizational performance go hand in hand. So you tend to get greater staff satisfaction, greater customer satisfaction, different attitudes to risk, but greater management effectiveness, better or more stable financial performance, and greater community engagement. And if you can help leaders and managers and their followers understand their purpose and their values, how to make better decisions, and how their behavior can impact on other people, then they can start to inspire other people as role models. And that works both ways. People learn from watching other people's ethical behavior just as much as they learn from watching people's unethical behavior. So role modeling is a key thing for managers to do. And managers should make decisions on the basis of values, not just rules. Rules are important, but not the only thing to help you to make decisions in the workplace. So it's worth thinking through how your managers make decisions and how they win hearts as well as minds. And the stats that you can see on the screen from the CMI and Moral DNA tell us about ethics in business. And what this shows us is that there are different perspectives and different pressures on managers and individuals and organizations. And that has the greatest bearing on whether managers and those individuals are prepared to behave ethically or unethically. So it changes depending on the culture of the organization. So I've got another question for you here, and I was hoping to do this as a poll, but polls are not working for us at the moment. So just pop your responses into chat or tell us on Twitter using the Performance Puzzle hashtag. What kinds of questions could you ask to determine whether a decision in the workplace is ethical, what kinds of questions would you use for like a mini checklist to determine whether something is ethical? So an obvious question would be, is it legal? Well, that's a very black and white answer. And if it's illegal, then it's probably unethical as well. But just because it's legal doesn't make it ethical. So there's a little bit of a different dimension there. What other questions could you ask? So you can ask, is it legal? Is it consistent with the organization's code of ethics or code of values? Code of conduct is another question that you could answer. Some other questions that you might want to think about as well. One that I often ask is, what would my mother think of this? So it depends very much on the qualities of your own individual mother, I guess, but it's an interesting way of looking at a conversation and a decision. Could you explain this to somebody who you hold in high regard? And what about this one? How would you feel about this decision being on the front page of tomorrow's newspapers? Would you feel comfortable with that? So there's a range of questions that I think you can ask in organizations to determine whether decisions that are being taken are ethical or not. But it's not easy to come up with a standard checklist that applies to every organization and every individual in the same situation, because everything is slightly different. I'm just reviewing some of the questions coming through in the chat panel. There's some interesting views on the previous question coming through about turning a blind eye to things. Some people would turn a blind eye to stealing stationery, but not if it was repeated. It would change their view of it. Some people would be thinking that one-offs are bad for bullying and harassment, but they're not bad for stealing stationery. So there's a continuum there of whether things are bad. So unethical behavior is not necessarily black and white. Some people saying it's circumstantial. And some people saying it's common stealing stationery. Well, it might be, but it's still unethical behavior if you look at it in a pure sense. So there's lots of ways in which you can do it. And some people saying that they wouldn't turn a blind eye to any of those things. So the latest question is about what kinds of questions you could ask to determine whether what's going on in the workplace is ethical or not. And we had things like, is it legal? Is it consistent with our code of conduct? What would my mother think? And how would I feel about it being on the front page of the newspapers? So they're all good things that you could do to try and work out whether something that you see in the workplace is ethical or not. But it's not easy. It's definitely not easy. So I'm going to give you a couple of dilemmas now to help you think through some of the issues that you might encounter from an HR or a management perspective. So give us your responses in the chat panel or tweet these out. I've got two dilemmas coming up, and this is the first one. Firstly, what would you do? How would you deal with this situation? So your company's got a firm policy about theft in the workplace, but they do sell their used equipment once a month. But you see, the day before this sale, somebody who is close to retirement slip an electric drill into his car without telling anybody. So he's avoided paying for it. So what would you do? How would you deal with that? Now, as an HR professional in an organization, you would encounter lots of unethical behavior of this manner. So it's what I would call low-level fraud. But you'd also see things like stealing stationery repeatedly. Sometimes things like conflicts of interest or not declaring conflicts of interest. Occasionally things like contrived recruitment or even false reporting. So there's a range of things that you would see in an organization that might have lost its way. And something for you to think about when you are in an organization trying to uphold ethical behavior is, what kinds of values or behaviors would you actually resign in order to uphold? So resigning from a job is a big thing. So what would actually cause you to resign if you saw something happening that you would think, I can't work for this organization anymore because I've seen something or taken part in something that's really at odds with the way I see the world of work? And it could be a dilemma like the one you see on screen here. So there's lots of information, lots of different ways of looking at ethical behaviour. And I think one of the more important things to do is to make these things visible in the workplace, to have these conversations about what is ethical behaviour, to start to question people's assumptions and their values and get some kind of common ground so that everybody understands it. Because if you don't, then you get dilemmas like this coming up regularly. So I've got another question for us here. Ideally, I would do this as a poll, but it's not going to be possible to do this as a poll. But whether your organization has an ethical code of practice, some organizations will. So give us your views in the chat panel here, or give us your views on Twitter using the Performance Puzzle hashtag. Ethical codes of practice are increasingly popular, especially with large businesses, and they tend to cover things like corporate social responsibility, how they deal with customers and their supply chain, their environmental policy, and rules around personal and corporate integrity. So if you have one, great, because it means your organization is actively considering how it and its employees needs to behave. And if you don't, then do you need one? I would suggest you need to have a conversation about one. Whether you need to write it down is another matter, but you need to have those conversations. And I wonder how many people would be prepared to leave their job if their employer didn't treat staff ethically. So when we looked earlier on at examples of businesses that don't behave ethically, things like Sports Direct, Primark, News of the World, how many employees who weren't involved in those scandals took it upon themselves to resign? How many people would feel so strongly about something as to leave an organization? So it's interesting that sometimes you will turn a blind eye to things because you'll carry on turning up to work even though you know things are happening that might be unethical. And many organizations will treat their staff legally but not ethically. And a question for you there is, what would you do about that? And if you have an organization that does that, then it's really in need of an ethical code of practice. So I'm going to give you another dilemma now. Here's another dilemma that you might come across in an HR perspective. So in your spare time at work, you've developed a world-leading spreadsheet program, powerful, easy, better than Excel, better than anything that's on the market. And you've done it in work's time. Your friend says, market it because you'll make millions of pounds. You're thinking about it, but you used company equipment to do it and you used company time to do it. But the company don't know that you did that. So how would you reconcile some of those things? And this is a real life dilemma that people face. And this is an ethical decision. So how would you do this? Give us your views in the chat panel here. Give us your views on Twitter. There is no necessarily right way of dealing with these, but using that ethical checklist that we talked about earlier on about, is it legal? What would my mum think of this? Would you be happy to see it on the front page of the newspapers? Is it in line with our code of practice? Those types of questions would help you narrow down the range of eventual outcomes you would reach with a dilemma like this. But it's a tricky one. And I hope to goodness I'm never in a situation where I have to deal with this. And I hope that nobody else is, but it could happen. And I'm sure if you're an HR professional, or even if you're any other manager in an organization, you've dealt with lots of real life dilemmas. And I wonder, what was your toughest dilemma? What are the areas of workplace conduct that concern you the most in terms of their ethical behavior? And I wonder what the worst case of unethical practices you've ever encountered in an organization. And I'm not asking you to share any sensitive details, but I'm sure you've got some details that you might be able to summarize. So if you have examples, then pop these in chat. So it'd be interesting to see some of those. So there are lots of different ethical dilemmas in the workplace, and one of the key roles that HR play in the workplace is to bring these to the forefront of the organizational discussions and culture. We're not the only function in an organization who takes part in this. We're not the sole guardians of business ethics, but we do have a very, very influential role to play. because we're responsible for managing lots of the employment policies and staff terms and conditions that help people to determine whether they need to make unethical decisions. So as a question that's just come through on the chat panel about, in HR we have the power to bring about change. Yes, we do. We very much do. We have the power to influence, and to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So there's chances for us to use our power for good and to bring about culture change in an organization. And I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts that I think there are benefits to acting ethically for business. You see businesses getting higher revenues from increased custom, better brand, better business awareness and recognition. You see better employee motivation and recruitment because people are attracted to work for ethical businesses. I did a poll of some students in a group I had about 6 months ago about whether they would be attracted to work for a business that was clearly an ethical business, and all of them said yes, to my great surprise. And I think that's typical of the younger generation coming through. It's a much bigger issue for the younger generation, possibly influenced by the media scandals that we all see. And as an ethical company, you can access new sources of finance too. There are ethical investors that invest in businesses that are clean and so on. And increasingly, you find that staff want to work for a business that behaves ethically and want them to do the same. So I think businesses need to be transparent and open in their dealings and their behavior and their culture if they're going to thrive. And the HR role is critical in this. It's not the only role, but it's one of the more influential ones. We can ensure that the organization treats people like adults and encourages adult conversations and relationships. Now, in doing that, we'll be able to unlock the next piece of the performance puzzle. And so hopefully today I've given you an idea of some of the things that you might need to consider in your organization, whether you need an ethical code of practice, whether your business would benefit from acting more ethically, how you can help managers and individuals to determine whether the decisions they make are ethical or unethical, and having conversations based around some of the dilemmas that I've shared with you today is a nice way of exposing and bringing to the forefront of the organizational conversation and culture what ethics is all about. So I'd encourage you to use some of those dilemmas. But I said I'd had 25 minutes worth of content today, and I've finished all the things that I want to share with you. I'm happy to take questions. So if you've got questions, let's have them in the chat panel and we'll see what comes through. And if we haven't got any questions, then I'll finish in a short while and I'll be able to respond to any questions that do come through after the event and share those with everybody. So let's have a look. There's some great stuff coming through in the chat panel. So I'm just going to have a look for the Q&A and see if there's anything there. We can see some great examples there of unethical behaviour coming through. People saying that it's in their employee handbook or code of conduct, which is great. I wonder how visible and how regularly refreshed and discussed some of those things are. Some interesting responses there to some of the dilemmas about whether they would speak to the individual or act upon the individual. So some great stuff coming through there. I'm aware there are some questions in the Q&A panel as well, so what I'll be able to do is respond to all of those and give you some views afterwards, and so they'll be emailed out. But I hope today that you've enjoyed what we've been talking about. It's given you some food for thought. Be very happy to continue this conversation with you, so by all means tweet me, by all means email me, get in touch, and we can have some more discussions about what ethical behaviour is. But I'm more or less done for today, so feel free to log off whenever is convenient for you, and I hope to see you at the next Performance Puzzle webinar in about a month's time. Thank you very much.